with a little flattering in her manner, between submission to a generous spirit and submission to a base or trivial one. Before the worthy Minor Canon was quite ready with his argument in reference to this nice distinction, Neville struck in. "Help me to clear myself with Mr. Crisparkle, Helena. Help me to convince him that I cannot be the first to make concessions without mockery and falsehood. My nature must be changed before I can do so, and it is not changed. I am sensible and inexpressible affront, and deliberate aggravation of inexpressible affront, and I am angry. The plain truth is, I am still as angry when I recall that night as I was that night." "Neville," hinted the Minor Canon with a steady countenance, "you have repeated that former action of your hands which I so much dislike." "I am sorry for it, sir, but it was involuntary. I confess that I was still as angry." "And I confess," said Mr. Crisparkle, "that I hoped for better things." "I am sorry to disappoint you, sir, but it would be far worse to deceive you, and I should deceive you grossly if I pretended that you had softened me in this respect. The time may come when your powerful influence will do even that with the difficult pupil whose antecedents you know. But it has not come yet. Is this so, and in spite of my struggles against myself, Helena?" She, whose dark eyes were watching the effect of what he said on Mr. Crisparkle's face, replied, to Mr. Crisparkle, not to him, "It is so." After a short pause, she answered the slightest look of inquiry conceivable in her brother's eyes with a slight and affirmative bend of her own head, and he went on. "I have never yet had the courage to say to you, sir, what in full openness I ought to have said when you first talked with me on this subject. It is not easy to say, and I have been withheld by a fear of its seeming ridiculous, which is very strong upon me down to this last moment, and might, but for my sister, prevent my being quite open with you even now. I admire Miss Budd, sir, so very much, that I cannot bear for her being treated with conceit or indifference, and even if I did not feel that I had an injury against young Drood on my own account, I should feel that I had an injury against him on hers." Mr. Crisparkle, in utter amazement, looked at Helena for corroboration, and met in her expressive face full corroboration and a plea for advice. "The young lady of whom you speak is, as you know, Mr. Neville, shortly to be married," said Mr. Crisparkle, gravely. "Therefore your admiration, if it be of that special nature which you seem to indicate, is outrageously misplaced. Moreover, it is monstrous that you should take upon yourself to be the young lady's champion against her chosen husband. Besides, you have seen them only once. The young lady has become your sister's friend, and I wonder that your sister, even on her behalf, has not checked you in this irrational and culpable fancy." "She has tried, sir, but uselessly. Husband or no husband, that fellow is incapable of the feeling with which I am inspired towards the beautiful young creature whom he treats like a doll. I say he is as incapable of it as he is unworthy of her. I say she is sacrificed in being bestowed upon him. I say that I love her, and despise and hate him." This with a face so flushed and a gesture so violent that his sister crossed to his side and caught his arm, remonstrating, "Neville, Neville!" Thus recalled to himself, he quickly became sensible of having lost the guard he had set upon his passionate tendency, and covered his face with his hand as one repentant and wretched. Mr. Crisparkle, watching him attentively, and at the same time meditating how to proceed, walked on for some paces in silence. Then he spoke. "Mr. Neville, Mr. Neville, I am sorely grieved to see in you more traces of a character as sullen, angry, and wild as the night now closing in. They are of too serious an aspect to leave me the resource of treating the infatuation you have disclosed as undeserving serious consideration. I give it very serious consideration, and I speak to you accordingly. This feud between you and young Drood must not go on. I cannot permit it to go on any longer, knowing what I know now from you, and you living under my roof. Whatever prejudice and unauthorized constructions your blind and envious wrath may put upon his character, it is a frank, good-natured character. I know I can trust it for that. Now, pray observe what I am about to say. On reflection, and on your sister's representation, I am willing to admit that, in making peace with young Drood, you have a right to be met halfway. I will engage that you shall be, and even that young Drood shall make the first advance. This condition fulfilled, you will pledge me the honour of a Christian gentleman that the quarrel is for ever at an end on your side. What may be in your heart when you give him your hand can only be known to the searcher of all hearts, but it will never go well with you if there be any treachery there. So far as to that, next as to what I must again speak of as your infatuation. I understand it to have been confided to me, and to be known to no other person save your sister and yourself. Do I understand aright?" Helena answered in a low voice. "It is only known to us three who are here together. It is not at all known to the young lady, your friend?" "On my soul, no." "I require you, then, to give me your similar and solemn pledge, Mr. Neville, that it shall remain the secret it is, and that you will take no other action whatsoever upon it than endeavouring, and that most earnestly, to erase it from your mind. I will not tell you that it will soon pass. I will not tell you that it is the fancy of the moment. I will not tell you that such caprices have their rise and fall among the young and ardent every hour. I will leave you undisturbed in the belief that it has few parallels or none, that it will abide with you a long time, and that it will be very difficult to conquer. So much the more weight shall I attach to the pledge I require from you when it is unreservedly given." The young man twice or thrice essayed to speak, but failed. "Let me leave you with your sister, whom it is time you took home," said Mr. Crisparkle. "You will find me alone in my room by and by." "Pray do not leave us yet," Helena implored him. "Another minute." "I should not," said Neville, pressing his hand upon his face, "have needed so much as another minute if you had been less patient with me, Mr. Crisparkle, less considerate of me, and less unpretendingly good and true. Oh, if in my childhood I had known such a guide." "Follow your guide now, Neville," murmured Helena, "and follow him to heaven." There was that in her tone which broke the good Minor Canon's voice, or it would have repudiated her exaltation of him. As it was, he laid a finger on his lips and looked towards her brother. "To say that I give both pledges, Mr. Crisparkle, out of my innermost heart, and to say that there is no treachery in it, is to say nothing." Thus Neville, greatly moved. "I beg your forgiveness in my miserable lapse into a burst of passion." "Not mine, Neville, not mine. You know with whom forgiveness lies, as the highest attribute conceivable. Miss Helena, you and your brother are twin children. You came into this world with the same dispositions, and you pass your younger days together surrounded by the same adverse circumstances. What you have to overcome in yourself, can you not overcome in him? You see the rock that lies in this course. Who but you can keep him clear of it?" "Who but you, sir?" replied Helena. "What is my influence or my weak wisdom compared with yours?" "You have the wisdom of love," returned the Minor Canon, "and it was the highest wisdom ever known upon this earth, remember. As to mine, but the less said of that commonplace commodity, the better. Good night." She took the hand he offered her, and gratefully and almost reverently raised it to her lips. "Tut!" said the Minor Canon softly. "I am much overpaid," and turned away. Retracing his steps towards the cathedral close, he tried, as he went along in the dark, to think out the best means of bringing to pass what he had promised to effect, and what must somehow be done. "I shall probably be asked to marry them," he reflected, "and I would they were married and gone, but this presses first." He debated principally whether he should write to young Drood, or whether he should speak to Jasper. The consciousness of being popular with the whole cathedral establishment inclined him to the latter course, and the well-timed sight of the lighted gatehouse decided him to take it. "I will strike while the iron is hot," he said, "and see him now." Jasper was lying asleep on a couch before the fire when, having ascended the postern stair and received no answer to his knock at the door, Mr. Crisparkle gently turned the handle and looked in. Long afterwards he had cause to remember how Jasper sprang from the couch in a delirious state between sleeping and waking, and crying out, "What is the matter? Who did it?" "It is only I, Jasper. I am sorry to have disturbed you." The glare of his eyes settled down into a look of recognition, and he moved a chair or two to make a way to the fireside. "I was dreaming a great rate, and am glad to be disturbed from an indigestive after-dinner sleep, not to mention that you are always welcome." "Thank you. I am not confident," returned Mr. Crisparkle, as he sat himself down in the easy chair placed for him, "that my subject will at first sight be quite as welcome as myself, but I am a minister of peace, and I pursue my subject in the interests of peace. In a word, Jasper, I want to establish peace between these two young fellows." A very perplexed expression took hold of Mr. Jasper's face, a very perplexing expression too, for Mr. Crisparkle could make nothing of it. "How?" was Jasper's inquiry, in a low and slow voice, after a silence. "For the how I come to you. I want to ask you to do me the great favour and service of interposing with your nephew. I have already interposed with Mr. Neville, and getting him to write you a short note, in his lively way, saying that he is willing to shake hands. I know what a good-natured fellow he is, and what influence you have with him, and without in the least defending Mr. Neville, we must all admit that he was bitterly stung." Jasper turned that perplexed face towards the fire. Mr. Crisparkle continued to observe it, found it even more perplexing than before, inasmuch as it seemed to denote, which could hardly be, some close internal calculation. "I know that you are not prepossessed in Mr. Neville's favour," the Minor Canon was going on, when Jasper stopped him. "You have cause to say so. I am not, indeed." "Undoubtedly, and I admit his lamentable violence of temper, though I hope he and I will get the better of it between us. But I have exacted a very solemn promise for him as to his future demeanour towards your nephew, if you do kindly interpose, and I am sure he will keep it." "You are always responsible and trustworthy, Mr. Crisparkle. Do you really feel sure that you can answer for him so confidently?" "I do." The perplexed and perplexing look vanished. "Then you relieve my mind of a great dread and a heavy weight," said Jasper. "I will do it." Mr. Crisparkle, delighted by the swiftness and completeness of his success, acknowledged it in the handsomest terms. "I will do it," repeated Jasper, "for the comfort of having your guarantee against my vague and unfounded fears. You will laugh, but do you keep a diary?" "A line for a day, not more." "A line for a day would be quite as much as my uneventful life would need, heaven knows," said Jasper, taking a book from a desk. "But that my diary is, in fact, a diary of Ned's life, too. You will laugh at this entry. You will guess when it was made. Past midnight. After what I have just seen now, I have a morbid dread upon me of some horrible consequences resulting to my dear boy, that I cannot reason with or in any way contend against. All my efforts are vain. The demoniacal passion of this Neville Landless, his strength in his fury, and his savage rage for the destruction of its object appall me. So profound is the impression that twice since I have gone into my dear boy's room to assure myself of his sleeping safely and not lying dead in his blood. Here is another entry next morning. Ned up and away, light-hearted and unsuspicious as ever. He laughed when I cautioned him and said he was as good a man as Neville Landless any day. I told him that might be, but he was not as bad a man. He continued to make light of it, but I travelled with him as far as I could and left him most unwillingly. I am unable to shake off these dark, intangible presentiments of evil, if feelings founded upon staring facts are to be so called. Again and again, said Jasper in conclusion, twirling the leaves of the book before putting it by, I have relapsed into these moods, as other entries show, but I have now your assurance at my back, and shall put it in my book, and make it an antidote to my black humours. Such an antidote, I hope, returned Mr. Crisparkle, as will induce you before long to consign the black humours to the flames. I ought to be the last to find any fault with you this evening, when you have met my wishes so freely, but I must say, Jasper, that your devotion to your nephew has made you execrative here. You are my witness, said Jasper, shrugging his shoulders, what my state of mind honestly was that night before I sat down to write, and in what words I expressed it. You remember objecting to a word I used as being too strong? It was a stronger word than any in my diary. Well, try the antidote, rejoined Mr. Crisparkle, and may it give you a brighter and better view of the case. We will discuss it no more now. I have to thank you for myself. Thank you sincerely. You shall find, said Jasper, as they shook hands, that I will not do the thing you wish me to do by halves. I will take care that Ned, giving way at all, shall give way thoroughly. On the third day after this conversation, he called on Mr. Crisparkle with the following letter. My dear Jack, I am touched by your account of your interview with Mr. Crisparkle, whom I much respect and esteem. At once I openly say that I forgot myself on that occasion quite as much as Mr. Landless did, and that I wish that bygone to be a bygone, and all to be right again. Look here, dear old boy, ask Mr. Landless to dinner on Christmas Eve. The better the day, the better the deed, and let there be only we three, and let us shake hands all round there and then, and say no more about it. My dear Jack, ever your most affectionate, Edwin Drood. P.S. Love to Miss Pussy at the next music lesson. You expect Mr. Neville, then? Said Mr. Crisparkle. I count upon his coming, said Mr. Jasper. Chapter 11. A Picture and a Ring. Behind the most ancient part of Holborn, London, where certain gabled houses some centuries of age still stand looking on the public way, as if disconsolately looking for the old bourne that has long run dry, is a little nook composed of two irregular quadrangles called Staple Inn. It is one of those nooks, the turning into which out of the clashing street imparts to the relieved pedestrian the sensation of having put cotton in his ears and velvet soles on his boots. It is one of those nooks where a few smoky sparrows twitter in smoky trees, as though they called to one another, "Let us play at country," and where a few feet of garden mould and a few yards of gravel enable them to do that refreshing violence to their tiny understandings. Moreover, it is one of those nooks which are legal nooks, and it contains a little hall, with a little lantern in its roof, to what obstructive purposes devoted, and at whose expense, this history knoweth not. In the days when Cloisterham took offence at the existence of a railroad afar off, as menacing that sensitive constitution, the property of us Britons, the odd fortune of which sacred institution it is to be in exactly equal degrees croaked about, trembled for, and boasted of, whatever happens to anything anywhere in the world. In those days no neighbouring architecture of lofty proportions had arisen to overshadow Staple Inn. The westering sun bestowed bright glances on it, and the south-west wind blew into it unimpeded. Neither wind nor sun, however, favoured Staple Inn one December afternoon towards 6 o'clock, when it was filled with fog, and candles shed murky and blared rays through the windows of all its then occupied sets of chambers. Notably, from a set of chambers in a corner house in the little inner quadrangle, presenting in black and white over its ugly portal the mysterious inscription, P.J.T. 1747. In which set of chambers, never having troubled his head about the inscription, unless to bethink himself at odd times on glancing up at it, that haply it might mean, perhaps, John Thomas, or perhaps Joe Tyler, sat Mr. Grugrius writing by his fire. Who could have told, by looking at Mr. Grugrius, whether he had ever known ambition or disappointment? He had been bred to the bar, and had laid himself out for chamber practice to draw deeds. Convey the wise it call, as Pistol says. But conveyancing and he had made such a very indifferent marriage of it that they had separated by consent, if there can be said to be separation where there has never been coming together. No, coy conveyancing would not come to Mr. Grugrius. She was wooed, not won, and they went their several ways. But an arbitration being blown towards him by some unaccountable wind, and he gaining great credit in it as one indefatigable in seeking out right and doing right, a pretty fat receivership was next blown into his pocket by a wind more traceable to its source. So, by chance, he had found his niche. Receiver and agent now to two rich estates, and deputing their legal business in an amount worth having to a firm of solicitors on the floor below, he had snuffed out his ambition, supposing him to have ever lighted it, and had settled down with his snuffers for the rest of his life under the dry vine and fig tree of P.J.T., who planted in 1747. Many accounts and account books, many files of correspondence, and several strong boxes garnished Mr. Grewgious's room. They can scarcely be represented as having lumbered it, so conscientious and precise was their orderly arrangement. The apprehension of dying suddenly and leaving one fact or one figure with any incompleteness or obscurity attaching to it would have stretched Mr. Grewgious stone dead any day. The largest fidelity to a trust was the lifeblood of the man. There are sorts of lifeblood that course more quickly, more gaily, more attractively, but there is no better sort in circulation. There was no luxury in his room. Even its comforts were limited to its being dry and warm, and having a snug though faded fireside. What may be called its private life was confined to the hearth, and an easy-chair, and an old-fashioned occasional round table that was brought out upon the rug after business hours, from a corner where it elsewhere remained turned up like a shiny mahogany shield. Behind it, when standing thus on the defensive, was a closet, usually containing something good to drink. An outer room was the clerk's room. Mr. Grewgious's sleeping room was across the common stair, and he held some not empty cellarage at the bottom of the common stair. 300 days in the year, at least, he crossed over to the hotel in Furnival's Inn for his dinner, and after dinner crossed back again to make the most of these simplicities until it should become broad business day once more with P.J.T. Date 1747. As Mr. Grewgious sat and wrote by his fire that afternoon, so did the clerk of Mr. Grewgious sit and write by his fire, a pale, puffy-faced, dark-haired person of 30, with big, dark eyes that wholly wanted lustre, and a dissatisfied, doughy complexion that seemed to ask to be sent to the baker's. This attendant was a mysterious being, possessed of some strange power over Mr. Grewgious, as though he had been called into existence like a fabulous familiar by a magic spell which had failed when required to dismiss him. He stuck tight to Mr. Grewgious's stool, although Mr. Grewgious's comfort and convenience would manifestly have been advanced by disposing of him. A gloomy person with tangled locks and a general air of having been reared under the shadow of that baleful tree of Java which has given shelter to more lies than the whole botanical kingdom, Mr. Grewgious, nevertheless, treated him with unaccountable consideration. "Now, Bazzard," said Mr. Grewgious, on the entrance of his clerk, looking up from his papers as he arranged them for the night, "what is in the wind besides fog?" "Mr. Drood," said Bazzard. "What of him?" "Has called," said Bazzard. "You might have shown him in." "I am doing it," said Bazzard. The visitor came in accordingly. "Dear me," said Mr. Grewgious, looking round his pair of office candles. "I thought you had called and merely left your name and gone. How do you do, Mr. Edwin? Dear me, you're choking." "It's the fog," returned Edwin, "and it makes my eyes smart, like canine pepper." "Is it really so bad as that? Pray undo your wrappers. It's fortunate I have so good a fire, but Mr. Bazzard has taken care of me." "No, I haven't," said Mr. Bazzard at the door. "Ah, then it follows that I must have taken care of myself without observing it," said Mr. Grewgious. "Pray be seated in my chair. No, I beg, coming out of such an atmosphere, in my chair." Edwin took the easy chair in the corner, and the fog he had brought in with him, and the fog he took off with his greatcoat and neck-shawl, was speedily licked up by the eager fire. "I look," said Edwin, smiling, "as if I had come to stop." "By the by," cried Mr. Grewgious, "excuse my interrupting you. Do stop. The fog may clear in an hour or two. We can have dinner in from just across Holborn. You had better take your canine pepper here than outside. Pray stop and dine." "You are very kind," said Edwin, glancing about him as though attracted by the notion of a new and relishing sort of gipsy party. "Not at all," said Mr. Grewgious. "You are very kind to join issue with a bachelor in chambers and take pot luck. And I'll ask," said Mr. Grewgious, dropping his voice and speaking with a twinkle eye, as if inspired with a bright thought, "I'll ask Bazzard. He mightn't like it else. Bazzard?" Bazzard reappeared. "Dine presently with Mr. Drood and me?" "If I'm ordered to dine, of course I will, sir," was the gloomy answer. "Save the man!" cried Mr. Grewgious. "You're not ordered, you're invited." "Thank you, sir," said Bazzard. "In that case, I don't care if I do." "That's arranged. And perhaps you wouldn't mind," said Mr. Grewgious, "stepping over to the hotel in Furnival's and asking them to send in materials for laying the cloth. For dinner, we'll have a tureen of the hottest and strongest soup available, and we'll have the best made dish that can be recommended, and we'll have a joint, such as a haunch of mutton, and we'll have a goose, or a turkey, or any little stuffed thing of that sort that may happen to be in the bill of fare. In short, we'll have whatever there is on hand." These liberal directions Mr. Grewgious issued with his usual air of reading an inventory, or repeating a lesson, or doing anything else by rote. Bazzard, after drawing out the round table, withdrew to execute them. "I was a little delicate, you see," said Mr. Grewgious, in a lower tone, after his clerk's departure, "about employing him in the foraging or commissariat department, because he mightn't like it." "He seems to have his own way, sir," remarked Edwin. "His own way?" returned Mr. Grewgious. "Oh dear, no, poor fellow, you quite mistake him. If he had his own way, he wouldn't be here." "I wonder where he would be," Edwin thought, but he only thought it, because Mr. Grewgious came and stood himself with his back to the other corner of the fire and his shoulder-blades against the chimney-piece, and collected his skirts for easy conversation. "I take it, without having the gift of prophecy, that you have done me the favour of looking in to mention that you are going down yonder, where, I can tell you, you are expected, and to offer to execute any little commission from me to my charming ward, and perhaps to sharpen me up a bit in any proceedings. Eh, Mr. Edwin?" "I called, sir, before going down, as an act of attention." "Of attention?" said Mr. Grewgious. "Ah, of course, not of impatience." "Impatience, sir?" Mr. Grewgious had meant to be arch, not that he in the remotest degree expressed that meaning, and had brought himself into scarcely supportable proximity with the fire, as if to burn the fullest effect of his archness into himself, as other subtle impressions are burnt into hard metals. But his archness suddenly flying before the composed face and manner of his visitor, and only the fire remaining, he started and rubbed himself. "I have lately been down yonder," said Mr. Grewgious, rearranging his skirts, And that was what I referred to when I said I could tell you are expected. Indeed, sir. Yes, I knew that Pussy was looking out for me. Do you keep a cat down there? Asked Mr. Grewgious. Edwin coloured a little as he explained. I call Rosa Pussy. Oh, really? Said Mr. Grewgious, smoothing down his head. That's very affable. Edwin glanced at his face, uncertain whether or no he seriously objected to the appellation. But Edwin might as well have glanced at the face of a clock. A pet name, sir, he explained again. Said Mr. Grewgious with a nod. But with such an extraordinary compromise between an unqualified assent and a qualified dissent that his visitor was much disconcerted. Did Rosa, Edwin began by way of recovering himself. Rosa? Repeated Mr. Grewgious. I was going to say Pussy and changed my mind. Did she tell you anything about the Landlesses? No, said Mr. Grewgious. What is the Landlesses? An estate? A villa? A farm? A brother and sister. The sister is at the nun's house and has become a great friend of Rosa's? Mr. Grewgious struck in, with a fixed face. She is a strikingly handsome girl, sir, and I thought she might have been described to you, or presented to you, perhaps. Neither, said Mr. Grewgious. But here is Buzzard. Buzzard returned accompanied by 2 waiters, an immovable waiter and a flying waiter, and the 3 brought in with them as much fog as gave a new roar to the fire. The flying waiter, who had brought everything on his shoulders, laid the cloth with amazing rapidity and dexterity, while the immovable waiter, who had brought nothing, found fault with him. The flying waiter then highly polished all the glasses he had brought, and the immovable waiter looked through them. The flying waiter then flew across Holborn for the soup, and flew back again, and then took another flight for the made dish, and flew back again, and then took another flight for the joint and poultry, and flew back again, and between whiles took supplementary flights for a great variety of articles, as it was discovered from time to time that the immovable waiter had forgotten them all. But let the flying waiter cleave the air as he might, he was always reproached on his return by the immovable waiter for bringing fog with him and being out of breath. At the conclusion of the repast, by which time the flying waiter was severely blown, the immovable waiter gathered up the tablecloth under his arm with a grand air, and having sternly, not to say with indignation, looked on at the flying waiter while he set the clean glasses round, directed a valedictory glance towards Mr. Grewgious, conveying, "Let it be clearly understood between us that the reward is mine, and that nil is the claim of this slave," and pushed the flying waiter before him out of the room. It was like a highly finished miniature painting representing my lords of the Circumcollusion Department, Commandership-in-Chief of any sort, government. It was quite an edifying little picture to be hung on the line in the National Gallery. As the fog had been the proximate cause of this sumptuous repast, so the fog served for its general source. To hear the outdoor clerks sneezing, wheezing, and beating their feet on the gravel was a zest far surpassing Dr. Kitchener's. To bid, with a shiver, the unfortunate flying waiter shut the door before he had opened it was a condiment of a profounder flavour than Harvey. And here let it be noticed, parenthetically, that the leg of this young man, in its application to the door, evinced the finest sense of touch, always preceding himself and tray with something of an angling air about it by some seconds, and always lingering after he and the tray had disappeared, like Macbeth's leg when accompanying him off the stage with reluctance to the assassination of Duncan. The host had gone below to the cellar and had brought up bottles of ruby, straw-coloured, and golden drinks, which had ripened long ago in the lands where no fogs are, and had since lain slumbering in the shade. Sparkling and tingling after so long a nap, they pushed at their corks to help the corkscrew, like prisoners helping rioters to force their gates, and danced out gaily. If P.J.T. in 1747 or in any other year of this period drank such wines, then for a certainty P.J.T. was pretty jolly too. Externally, Mr. Grugius showed no signs of being mellowed by these glowing vintages. Instead of his drinking them, they might have been poured over him in his high-dried snuff form and run to waste, for any lights and shades they caused to flicker over his face. Neither was his manner influenced, but in his wooden way he had observant eyes for Edwin, and when, at the end of dinner, he motioned Edwin back to his own easy chair in the fireside corner, and Edwin sank luxuriously into it after very brief remonstrance, Mr. Grugius, as he turned his seat round towards the fire too, and smoothed his head and face, might have been seen looking at his visitor between his smoothing fingers. "Bazzard," said Mr. Grugius, suddenly turning to him. "I follow you, sir," returned Bazzard, who had done his work of consuming meat and drink in a workmanlike manner, though mostly in speechlessness. "I drink to you, Bazzard. Mr. Edwin, success to Mr. Bazzard." "Success to Mr. Bazzard," echoed Edwin, with a totally unfounded appearance of enthusiasm, and with the unspoken addition, "What in, I wonder?" "And may," pursued Mr. Grugius, "I am not at liberty to be definite. May, my controversial powers are so very limited that I know not I shall come well out of this. May, it ought to be put imaginatively, but I have no imagination. May, the thorn of anxiety is as nearly the mark as I am likely to get. May it come out at last." Mr. Bazzard, with a frowning smile at the fire, put a hand into his tangled locks, as if the thorn of anxiety were there, then into his waistcoat, as if it were there, then into his pockets, as if it were there. In all these movements he was closely followed by the eyes of Edwin, as if that young gentleman expected to see the thorn in action. It was not produced, however, and Mr. Bazzard merely said, "I follow you, sir, and I thank you." "I am going," said Mr. Grugius, jingling his glass on the table with one hand, and bending aside under cover of the other to whisper to Edwin, "to drink to my ward, but I put Bazzard first. He mightn't like it else." This was said with a mysterious wink, or what would have been a wink if, in Mr. Grugius's hands, it could have been quick enough. So Edwin winked responsively, without the least idea what he meant by doing so. "And now," said Mr. Grugius, "I devote a bumper to the fair and fascinating Miss Rosa. Bazzard, the fair and fascinating Miss Rosa." "I follow you, sir," said Bazzard, "and I pledge you." "And so do I," said Edwin. "Lord bless me," cried Mr. Grugius, breaking the blank silence which of course ensued. Though why these pauses should come upon us when we have performed any small social rite, not directly inducive of self-examination or mental despondency, who can tell? I am a particularly angular man, and yet I fancy, if I may use the word, not having a morsel of fancy, that I could draw a picture of a true lover's state of mind tonight." "Let us follow you, sir," said Bazzard, "and have the picture." "Mr. Edwin will correct it where it's wrong," resumed Mr. Grewgious, "and will throw in a few touches from the life. I dare say it is wrong in many particulars, and wants many touches from the life, for I was born a chip, and have neither soft sympathies nor soft experiences. Well, I hazard the guess that the true lover's mind is completely permeated by the beloved object of his affections. I hazard the guess that her dear name is precious to him, cannot be heard or repeated without emotion, and is preserved sacred. If he has any distinguishing appellation of fondness for her, it is reserved for her, and is not for common ears. A name that it would be a privilege to call her by, being alone with her own bright self, it would be a liberty, a coldness, an insensibility, almost a breach of good faith, to flaunt elsewhere. It was wonderful to see Mr. Grewgious sitting bolt upright, with his hands on his knees, continuously chopping this discourse out of himself, much as a charity boy with a very good memory might get his catechism said, and evincing no correspondent emotion whatever, unless in a certain occasional little tingling perceptible at the end of his nose. "My picture," Mr. Grewgious proceeded, "goes on to represent, under correction from you, Mr. Edwin, the true lover as ever impatient to be in the presence or vicinity of the beloved object of his affections, as caring very little for his case in any other society, and as constantly seeking that. If I was to say seeking that, as a bird seeks its nest, I should make an ass of myself, because that would trench upon what I understand to be poetry, and I am so far from trenching upon poetry at any time that I never, to my knowledge, got within 10,000 miles of it. And I am, besides, totally unacquainted with the habits of birds, except the birds of Staple Inn, who seek their nests on ledges and in gutter pipes and chimney-pots, not constructed for them by the beneficent hand of nature. I beg, therefore, to be understood as foregoing the bird's nest, but my picture does represent the true lover as having no existence separable from that of the beloved object of his affections, and as living at once a doubled life and a halved life. And if I do not clearly express what I mean by that, it is either for the reason that, having no conversational powers, I cannot express what I mean, or that, having no meaning, I do not mean what I fail to express, which, to the best of my belief, is not the case." Edwin had turned red and turned white as certain points of this picture came into the light. He now sat looking at the fire and bit his lip. "The speculations of an angular man," resumed Mr. Grewgious, still sitting and speaking exactly as before, "are probably erroneous on so global a topic. But I figure to myself, subject as before to Mr. Edwin's correction, that there can be no coolness, no lassitude, no doubt, no indifference, no half-fire and half-smoke state of mind in a real lover. Pray, am I at all near the mark in my picture?" As abrupt in his conclusion as in his commencement and progress, he jerked this inquiry at Edwin, and stopped when one might have supposed him in the middle of his oration. I should say, sir," stammered Edwin, "as you refer the question to me—" "Yes," said Mr. Grewgious, "I refer it to you as an authority." "I should say then, sir," Edwin went on, embarrassed, "that the picture you have drawn is generally correct, but I submit that perhaps you may be rather hard upon the unlucky lover." "Likely so," assented Mr. Grewgious. "Likely so. I am a hard man in the grain." "He may not show," said Edwin, "all he feels, or he may not." There he stopped so long to find the rest of his sentence that Mr. Grewgious rendered his difficulty 1,000 times the greater by unexpectedly striking in with, "No, to be sure, he may not." After that they all sat silent, the silence of Mr. Bazzard being occasioned by slumber. "His responsibility is very great, though," said Mr. Grewgious at length, with his eyes on the fire. Edwin nodded assent, with his eyes on the fire. "And let him be sure that he trifles with no one," said Mr. Grewgious, "neither with himself nor with any other." Edwin bit his lip again, and still sat looking at the fire. "He must not make a plaything of a treasure. Woe betide him if he does. Let him take that well to heart," said Mr. Grewgious. Though he said these things in short sentences, much as the supposititious charity boy just now referred to might have repeated a verse or two from the book of Proverbs, there was something dreamy, for so literal a man, in the way in which he now shook his right forefinger at the live coals in the grate, and again fell silent. But not for long. As he sat upright and stiff in his chair, he suddenly rapped his knees, like the carved image of some queer joss or other coming out of its reverie, and said, "We must finish this bottle, Mr. Edwin. Let me help you. I'll help Bazzard too, though he is asleep. He mightn't like it else." He helped them both, and helped himself, and drained his glass, and stood it bottom upward on the table, as though he had just caught a bluebottle in it. "And now, Mr. Edwin," he proceeded, wiping his mouth and hands upon his handkerchief, "to a little piece of business. You received from me, the other day, a certified copy of Miss Rosa's father's will. You knew its contents before, but you received it from me as a matter of business. I should have sent it to Mr. Jasper, but for Miss Rosa's wishing it to come straight to you in preference." "You received it?" "Quite safely, sir." "You should have acknowledged its receipt," said Mr. Grewgious. "Business being business all the world over. However, you did not." "I meant to have acknowledged it when I first came in this evening, sir." "Not a business-like acknowledgment," returned Mr. Grewgious. "However, let that pass. Now, in that document you have observed a few words of kindly allusion to its being left to me to discharge a little trust, confided to me in conversation at such time as I in my discretion may think best." "Yes, sir." "Mr. Edwin, it came into my mind just now, when I was looking at the fire, that I could, in my discretion, acquit myself of that trust at no better time than the present. Favour me with your attention half a minute." He took a bunch of keys from his pocket, singled out by the candlelight the key he wanted, and then, with a candle in his hand, went to a bureau or escritoire, unlocked it, touched the spring of a little secret drawer, and took from it in an ordinary ring-case made for a single ring. With this in his hand, he returned to his chair. As he held it up for the young man to see, his hand trembled. "Mr. Edwin, this rose of diamonds and rubies delicately set in gold was a ring belonging to Miss Rosa's mother. It was removed from her dead hand in my presence with such distracted grief as I hope it may never be my lot to contemplate again. Hard man as I am not hard enough for that. See how bright these stones shine, opening the case, and yet the eyes that were so much brighter, and that so often looked upon them with a light and a proud heart, have been ashes among ashes, and dust among dust some years. If I had any imagination, which it is needless to say I have not, I might imagine that the lasting beauty of these stones was almost cruel. He closed the case again as he spoke. This ring was given to the young lady who was drowned so early in her beautiful and happy career by her husband when they first plighted their faith to one another. It was he who removed it from her unconscious hand, and it was he who, when his death drew very near, placed it in mine. The trust in which I received it was that you and Miss Rosa, growing to manhood and womanhood, and your betrothal prospering and coming to maturity, I should give it to you to place upon her finger. Failing those desired results, it was to remain in my possession. Some trouble was in the young man's face, and some indecision was in the action of his hand, as Mr. Grugrius, looking steadfastly at him, gave him the ring. "Your placing it on her finger," said Mr. Grugrius, "will be the solemn seal upon your strict fidelity to the living and the dead. You are going to her to make the last irrevocable preparations for your marriage. Take it with you." The young man took the little case and placed it in his breast. "If anything should be amiss, if anything should be even slightly wrong between you, if you should have any secret consciousness that you are committing yourself to this step for no higher reason than because you have long been accustomed to look forward to it, then," said Mr. Grugrius, "I charge you once more, by the living and by the dead, to bring that ring back to me." Here Bazzard awoke himself by his own snoring, and, as is usual in such cases, sat apologetically staring at vacancy, as defying vacancy to accuse him of having been asleep. "Bazzard," said Mr. Grugrius, harder than ever. "I'll follow you, sir," said Bazzard, "and I have been following you. In discharge of a trust, I have handed Mr. Edwin Drood a ring of diamonds and rubies. You see?" Edwin reproduced the little case and opened it, and Bazzard looked into it. "I'll follow you both, sir," returned Bazzard, "and I'll witness the transaction." Evidently anxious to get away and be alone, Edwin Drood now resumed his outer clothing, muttering something about time and appointments. The fog was reported no clearer by the flying waiter, who alighted from a speculative flight in the coffee interest, but he went out into it, and Bazzard, after his manner, followed him. Mr. Grugrius, left alone, walked softly and slowly to and fro for an hour or more. He was restless tonight, and seemed dispirited. "I hope I have done right," he said. The appeal to him seemed necessary. It was hard to lose the ring, and yet it must have gone from me very soon. He closed the empty little drawer with a sigh, and shut and locked the escritoire, and came back to the solitary fireside. "Her ring," he went on. "Will it come back to me? My mind hangs about her ring very uneasily tonight. But that is explainable. I have had it so long, and I have prized it so much. I wonder—" He was in a wondering mood as well as a restless, for, though he checked himself at that point and took another walk, he resumed his wondering when he sat down again. "I wonder, for the 10,000th time, and what a weak fool I, for what can it signify now? Whether he confided the charge of their orphan child to me, because he knew, good God, how like her mother she has become. I wonder whether he ever so much as suspected that someone doted on her at a hopeless, speechless distance, when he struck in and won her. I wonder whether it ever crept into his mind who that unfortunate someone was. I wonder whether I shall sleep tonight. At all events, I will shut out the world with the bedclothes and try." Mr. Grugrius crossed the staircase to his raw and foggy bedroom, and was soon ready for bed. Dimly catching sight of his face in the misty looking-glass, he held his candle to it for a moment. "A likely someone you to come into anybody's thoughts in such an aspect," he exclaimed. "There, there, there. Get to bed, poor man, and cease to jabber." With that, he extinguished his light, pulled up the bedclothes around him, and with another sigh shut out the world. And yet there are such unexplored romantic nooks in the unlikeliest men, that even old Tinderus and Touchwoody P.J.T. possibly jabbered thus, at some odd times, in or about 1747. Chapter 12. A Night with Durdles. When Mr. Sapsea has nothing better to do towards evening, and finds the contemplation of his own profundity becoming a little monotonous in spite of the vastness of the subject, he often takes an airing in the cathedral close and thereabout. He likes to pass the churchyard with a swelling air of proprietorship, and to encourage in his breast a sort of benignant landlord feeling, in that he has been bountiful towards that meritorious tenant, Mrs. Sapsea, and has publicly given her a prize. He likes to see a stray face or two looking in through the railings, and perhaps reading his inscription. Should he meet a stranger coming from the churchyard with a quick step, he is morally convinced that the stranger is, with a blush retiring, as monumentally directed. Mr. Sapsea's importance has received enhancement, for he has become Mayor of Cloister. Without mayors, and many of them, it cannot be disputed that the whole framework of society, Mr. Sapsea is confident that he invented that forcible figure, would fall to pieces. Mayors have been knighted for going up with addresses, explosive machines intrepidly discharging shot and shell into the English grammar. Mr. Sapsea may go up with an address. Rise, Sir Thomas Sapsea, of such is the salt of the earth. Mr. Sapsea has improved the acquaintance of Mr. Jasper since their first meeting to partake of port, epitaph, backgammon, beef and salad. Mr. Sapsea has been received at the gatehouse with kindred hospitality, and on that occasion Mr. Jasper seated himself at the piano and sang to him, tickling his ears, figuratively, long enough to present a considerable area for tickling. What Mr. Sapsea likes in that young man is that he is always ready to profit by the wisdom of his elders, and that he is sound, sir, at the core. In proof of which he sang to Mr. Sapsea that evening, no kickshaw ditties, favourites with national enemies, but gave him the genuine George III home-brewed, exhorting him, as my brave boys, to reduce to a smashed condition all other islands but this island, and all continents, peninsulas, isthmuses, promontories, and other geographical forms of land soever, besides sweeping the seas in all directions. In short, he rendered it pretty clear that Providence made a distinct mistake in originating so small a nation of hearts of oak and so many other verminous peoples. Mr. Sapsea, walking slowly this moist evening near the churchyard with his hands behind him, on the lookout for a blushing and retiring stranger, turns a corner and comes instead into the goodly presence of the Dean, conversing with the verger and Mr. Jasper. Mr. Sapsea makes his obeisance and is instantly stricken far more ecclesiastical than any Archbishop of York or Canterbury. "You are evidently going to write a book about us, Mr. Jasper?" quoth the Dean. "To write a book about us. Well, we are very ancient, and we ought to make a good book. We are not so richly endowed in possessions as in age, but perhaps you will put that in your book, among other things, and call attention to our wrongs." Mr. Tope, as in duty bound, is greatly entertained by this. "I really have no intention at all, sir," replies Jasper, "of turning author or archaeologist. It is but a whim of mine, and even for my whim, Mr. Sapsea here is more accountable than I am." "How so, Mr. Mayor?" says the Dean, with a nod of good-natured recognition of his fetch. "How is that, Mr. Mayor?" "I am not aware," Mr. Sapsea remarks, looking about him for information, "to what the very Reverend the Dean does me the honour of referring," and then falls to studying his original in minute points of detail. "Durdles," Mr. Tope hints. "Aye," the Dean echoes, "Durdles, Durdles." "The truth is, sir," explains Jasper, "that my curiosity in the man was first really stimulated by Mr. Sapsea. Mr. Sapsea's knowledge of mankind and power of drawing out whatever is recluse or odd around him first led to my bestowing a second thought upon the man, though, of course, I had met him constantly about. You would not be surprised by this, Mr. Dean, if you had seen Mr. Sapsea deal with him in his own parlour, as I did." "Oh," cries Sapsea, picking up the ball thrown to him with ineffable complacency and pomposity. Yes, the very Reverend the Dean refers to that. Yes, I happened to bring Durdles and Mr. Jasper together. I regard Durdles as a character." "A character, Mr. Sapsea, that with a few skilful touches you turn inside out," says Jasper. "Nay, not quite that," returns the lumbering auctioneer. "I may have a little influence over him, perhaps, and a little insight into his character, perhaps. The very Reverend the Dean will please to bear in mind that I have seen the world." Here Mr. Sapsea gets a little behind the Dean to inspect his coat buttons. "Well," says the Dean, looking about him to see what has become of his copyist, "I hope, Mr. Mayor, you will use your study and knowledge of Durdles to the good purpose of exhorting him not to break our worthy and respected choir-master's neck. We cannot afford it. His head and voice are much too valuable to us." Mr. Tope is again highly entertained, and, having fallen into respectful convulsions of laughter, subsides into a deferential murmur, importing that surely any gentleman would deem it a pleasure and an honour to have his neck broken in return for such a compliment from such a source. "I will take it upon myself, sir," observes Sapsea loftily, to answer for Mr. Jasper's neck. I will tell Durdles to be careful of it. He will mind what I say. How is it at present endangered? He inquires, looking about him with magnificent patronage. Only by my making a moonlight expedition with Durdles among the tombs, vaults, towers, and ruins, returns Jasper. You remember suggesting, when you brought us together, that as a lover of the picturesque, it might be worth my while? I remember, replies the auctioneer, and the solemn idiot really believes that he does remember. Profiting by your hint, pursues Jasper, I have had some day rambles with the extraordinary old fella, and we are to make a moonlight hole and corner exploration tonight. And here he is, says the Dean. Durdles, with his dinner bundle in his hand, is indeed beheld slouching towards them. Slouching nearer, and perceiving the Dean, he pulls off his hat, and is slouching away with it under his arm, when Mr. Sapsea stops him. Mind you take care of my friend, is the injunction Mr. Sapsea lays upon him. What friend of yourn is dead? Asks Durdles. No orders has come in for any friend of yourn. I mean my live friend there. Oh, him, says Durdles. He can take care of himself, can Mr. Jasper. But do you take care of him too, says Sapsea, whom Durdles, there being command in his tone, surlily surveys from head to foot. With submission to his reverence the Dean, if you'll mind what concerns you, Mr. Sapsea, Durdles, he'll mind what concerns him. You're out of temper, says Mr. Sapsea, winking to the company to observe how smoothly he will manage him. My friend concerns me, and Mr. Jasper is my friend, and you are my friend. Don't you get into a bad habit of boasting, retorts Durdles, with a grave cautionary nod. It'll grow upon you. You are out of temper, says Sapsea again, reddening, but again sinking to the company. I own to it, returns Durdles. I don't like liberties. Mr. Sapsea winks a third wink to the company, as who should say, I think you will agree with me that I have settled his business, and stalks out of the conservatory. Durdles then gives the Dean a good evening, and adding, as he puts his hat on, You'll find me at home, Mr. Jasper, as agreed, when you want me. I'm a-going home to clean myself. Soon slouches out of sight. This going home to clean himself is one of the man's incomprehensible compromises with inexorable facts. He, and his hat, and his boots, and his clothes, never showing any trace of cleaning, but being uniformly in one condition of dust and grit. The lamplighter, now dotting the quiet close with specks of light, and running at a great rate up and down his little ladder with that object, his little ladder under the sacred shadow of whose inconvenience generations had grown up, and which all Cloisterham would have stood aghast at the idea of abolishing, the Dean withdraws to his dinner, Mr. Tope to his tea, and Mr. Jasper to his piano. There, with no light but that of the fire, he sits chanting choir music in a low and beautiful voice for 2 or 3 hours, in short, until it has been for some time dark and the moon is about to rise. Then he closes his piano softly changes his coat for a pea-jacket, with a goodly wicker-cased bottle in its largest pocket, and putting on a low-crowned, flap-brimmed hat, goes softly out. Why does he move so softly tonight? No outward reason is apparent for it. Can there be any sympathetic reason crouching darkly within him? Repairing to Durdle's unfinished house, or hole in the city wall, and seeing a light within it, he softly picks his course among the gravestones, monuments, and stony lumber of the yard, already touched here and there sidewise by the rising moon. The two journeymen have left their two great saws sticking in their blocks of stone, and two skeleton journeymen out of the dance of death might be grinning in the shadow of their sheltering sentry boxes, about to slash away at cutting out the gravestones of the next two people destined to die in Cloister. Likely enough, the two think little of that now, being alive and perhaps merry. Curious to make a guess at the two, or say one of the two. "Ho, Durdles!" The light moves, and he appears with it at the door. He would seem to have been cleaning himself with the aid of a bottle, jug, and tumbler, for no other cleansing instruments are visible in the bare brick room with rafters overhead and no plastered ceiling, into which he shows his visitor. "Are you ready?" "I am ready, Mr. Jasper. Let the old uns come out if they dare, when we go among their tombs. My spirit is ready for 'em." "Do you mean animal spirits or ardent?" "The one's the t'other," answers Durdles, "and I mean 'em both." He takes a lantern from a hook, puts a match or two in his pocket wherewith to light it, should there be need, and they go out together, dinner bundle and all. Surely an unaccountable sort of expedition, that Durdles himself, who is always prowling among old graves and ruins like a ghoul, that he should be stealing forth to climb and dive and wander without an object, is nothing extraordinary. But that the choirmaster or anyone else should hold it worth his while to be with him, and to study moonlight effects in such company, is another affair. Surely an unaccountable sort of expedition, therefore. "Where that there mound by the yard gate, Mr. Jasper?" "I see it. What is it?" "Lime." Mr. Jasper stops and waits for him to come up, for he lags behind. "What you call quicklime?" "Aye," says Durdles, "quick enough to eat your boots, with a little handy stirring, quick enough to eat your bones." They go on, presently passing the red windows of the traveller's twopenny, and emerging into the clear moonlight of the monk's vineyard. This crossed, they come to Minor Canon Corner, of which the greater part lies in shadow until the moon shall rise higher in the sky. The sound of a closing house door strikes their ears, and two men come out. These are Mr. Crisparkle and Neville. Jasper, with a strange and sudden smile upon his face, lays the palm of his hand upon the breast of Durdles, stopping him where he stands. At that end of Minor Canon Corner, the shadow is profound in the existing state of the light. At that end, too, there is a piece of old dwarf wall, breast high, the only remaining boundary of what was once a garden, but is now the thoroughfare. Jasper and Durdles would have turned this wall in another instant, but, stopping so short, stand behind it. "Those two are only sauntering," Jasper whispers. "They will go out into the moonlight soon. Let us keep quiet here, or they will detain us, or want to join us, or what not." Durdle nods assent, and falls into munching some fragments from his bundle. Jasper folds his arms upon the top of the wall, and, with his chin resting on them, watches. He takes no note whatever of the Minor Canon, but watches Neville, as though his eye were at the trigger of a loaded rifle, and he had covered him, and were going to fire. A sense of destructive power is so expressed in his face that even Durdles pauses in his munching and looks at him, with an unmunched something in his cheek. Meanwhile, Mr. Crisparkle and Neville walk to and fro, quietly talking together. What they say cannot be heard consecutively, but Mr. Jasper has already distinguished his own name more than once. "This is the first day of the week," Mr. Crisparkle can be distinctly heard to observe as they turn back, "and the last day of the week is Christmas Eve." "You may be certain of me, sir." The echoes were favourable at those points, but as the two approach the sound of their talking becomes confused again. The word confidence, shattered by the echoes but still capable of being pieced together, is uttered by Mr. Crisparkle. As they draw still nearer, this fragment of a reply is heard. "Not deserved yet, but shall be, sir." As they turn away again, Jasper again hears his own name in connection with the words from Mr. Crisparkle. "Remember that I said I answered for you confidentially?" Then the sound of their talk becomes confused again, they halting for a little while and some earnest action on the part of Neville succeeding. When they move once more, Mr. Crisparkle is seen to look up at the sky and to point before him. They then slowly disappear, passing out into the moonlight at the opposite end of the corner. It is not until they are gone that Mr. Jasper moves, but then he turns to Durdles and bursts into a fit of laughter. Durdles, who still has that suspended something in his cheek, and who sees nothing to laugh at, stares at him until Mr. Jasper lays his face down on his arms to have his laugh out. Then Durdles bolts the something, as if desperately resigning himself to indigestion. Among those secluded nooks there is very little stir or movement after dark. There is little enough in the high tide of the day, but there is next to none at night. Besides that the cheerfully frequented High Street lies nearly parallel to the spot, the old cathedral rising between the two, and is the natural channel in which the Cloister traffic flows, a certain awful hush pervades the ancient pile, the cloisters, and the churchyard after dark, which not many people care to encounter. Ask the first 100 citizens of Cloister met at random in the streets at noon, if they believed in ghosts, they would tell you no. But put them to choose at night between these eerie precincts and the thoroughfare of shops, and you would find that 99 declared for the longer round and the more frequented way. The cause of this is not to be found in any local superstition that attaches to the precincts, albeit a mysterious lady, with a child in her arms and a rope dangling from her neck, has been seen flitting about there by sundry witnesses as intangible as herself, but it is to be sought in the innate shrinking of dust, with the breath of life in it from dust out of which the breath of life has passed. Also in the wildly diffused and almost as wildly unacknowledged reflection. If the dead do, under any circumstances, become visible to the living, these are such likely surroundings for the purpose that I, the living, will get out of them as soon as I can. Hence, when Mr. Jasper and Durdles pause to glance around them before descending into the crypt by a small side door, of which the latter has a key, the whole expanse of moonlight in their view is utterly deserted. One may fancy that the tide of life was stemmed by Mr. Jasper's own gatehouse. The murmur of the tide is heard beyond, but no wave passes the archway, over which his lamp burns red behind his curtain, as if the building were a lighthouse. They enter, locking themselves in, descend the rugged steps, and are down in the crypt. The lantern is not wanted, for the moonlight strikes in at the groined windows, bare of glass, the broken frames from which cast patterns to the ground. The heavy pillars which support the roof engender masses of black shade, but between them there are lanes of light. Up and down these lanes they walk, Durdles discoursing of the old uns he yet counts on disinterring, and slapping a wall in which he considers a whole family on 'em to be stoned and earthed up, just as if he were a familiar friend of the family. The taciturnity of Durdles is for the time overcome by Mr. Jasper's wicker bottle, which circulates freely, in the sense, that is to say, that its contents enter freely into Mr. Durdles' circulation, while Mr. Jasper only rinses his mouth once and casts forth the rinsing. They are to ascend the great tower. On the steps by which they rise to the cathedral, Durdles pauses for new store of breath. The steps are very dark, but out of the darkness they can see the lanes of light they have traversed. Durdles seats himself upon a step. Mr. Jasper seats himself upon another. The odour from the wicker bottle, which has somehow passed into Durdles' keeping, soon intimates that the cork has been taken out. But this is not ascertainable through the sense of sight, since neither can descry the other. And yet, in talking, they turn to one another as though their faces could commune together. "This is good stuff, Mr. Jasper." "It is very good stuff, I hope. I bought it on purpose." "They don't show, you see. The old uns don't, Mr. Jasper. It would be a more confused world than it is if they could." "Well, it would lead towards a mixing of things," Durdles acquiesces, pausing on the remark, as if the idea of ghosts had not previously presented itself to him in a merely inconvenient light, domestically or chronologically. "But do you think there may be ghosts of other things, though not of men and women?" "What things? Flower beds and watering pots? Horses and harness?" "No, sounds." "What sounds?" "Cries." "What cries do you mean? Chairs to mend?" "No, I mean screeches. Now, I'll tell you, Mr. Jasper. Wait a bit till I put the bottle right." Here the cork is evidently taken out again and replaced again. "There. Now it's right. This time last year, only a few days later, I happened to have been doing what was correct by the season, in the way of giving it the welcome it had a right to expect, when them town boys set on me at their worst. At length I gave 'em the slip and turned in here, and here I fell asleep. And what woke me? The ghost of a cry, the ghost of one terrific shriek, which shriek was followed by the ghost of the howl of a dog, a long, dismal, woeful howl, such as a dog gives when a person's dead. That was my last Christmas Eve." "What do you mean?" is the very abrupt and, one might say, fierce retort. "I mean that I made inquiries everywhere about, and that no living ears but mine heard that cry or that owl. So I say they was both ghosts, though why they came to me I've never made out." "I thought you were another kind of man," says Jasper scornfully. "So I thought myself," answers Durdles with his usual composure, "and yet I was picked out for it." Jasper had risen suddenly when he asked him what he meant, and he now says, "Come, we shall freeze here. Lead the way." Durdles complies, not over steadily, opens the door at the top of the steps with the key he has already used, and so emerges on the cathedral level in a passage at the side of the chancel. Here the moonlight is so very bright again that the colours of the nearest stained-glass window are thrown upon their faces. The appearance of the unconscious Durdles, holding the door open for his companion to follow, as if from the grave, is ghastly enough with a purple hand across his face and a yellow splash upon his brow, but he bears the close scrutiny of his companion in an insensible way, although it is prolonged while the latter fumbles among his pockets for a key confided to him that will open an iron gate so to enable them to pass to the staircase of the great tower. "That and the bottle are enough for you to carry," he says, giving it to Durdles. "Hand your bundle to me. I'm younger and longer-winded than you." Durdles hesitates for a moment between bundle and bottle, but gives the preference to the bottle as being by far the better company, and consigns the dry weight to his fellow explorer. Then they go up the winding staircase of the great tower, toilsomely, turning and lowering their heads to avoid the stairs above, or the rough stone pivot around which they twist. Durdles has lighted his lantern by drawing from the cold, hard wall a spark of that mysterious fire which lurks in everything, and, guided by his speck, they clamber up among the cobwebs and the dust. Their way lies through strange places. Twice or thrice they emerge into level, low-arched galleries, whence they can look down into the moonlit nave, and where Durdles, waving his lantern, waves the dim angels' heads upon the corbels of the roof, seeming to watch their progress. Anon they turn into narrower and steeper staircases, and the night air begins to blow upon them, and the chirp of some startled jackdaw or frightened rook precedes the heavy beating of wings in a confined space, and the beating down of dust and straws upon their heads. At last, leaving their light behind a stair, for it blows fresh up here, they look down on Cloister, fair to see in the moonlight, its ruined habitations and sanctuaries of the dead at the tower's base, its moss-softened red-tiled roofs and red-brick houses of the living clustered beyond, its river winding down from the mist on the horizon, as though that were its source, and already heaving with the restless knowledge of its approach towards the sea. Once again, an unaccountable expedition this. Jasper, always moving softly with no visible reason, contemplates the scene, and especially that stillest part of it which the cathedral overshadows. But he contemplates Durdles quite as curiously, and Durdles is by times conscious of his watchful eyes. Only by times, because Durdles is growing drowsy. As aeronauts lighten the load they carry when they wish to rise, similarly Durdles has lightened the wicker bottle in coming up. Snatches of sleep surprise him on his legs and stop him in his talk. A mild fit of calenture seizes him, in which he deems that the ground so far below is on a level with the tower, and would as lief walk off the tower into the air as not. Such is his state when they begin to come down, and as aeronauts make themselves heavier when they wish to descend, similarly Durdles charges himself with more liquid from the wicker bottle that he may come down the better. The iron gate attained and locked, but not before Durdles has tumbled twice and cut an eyebrow open once, they descend into the crypt again, with the intent of issuing forth as they entered. But while returning among those lanes of light, Durdles becomes so very uncertain, both of foot and speech, that he half drops, half throws himself down, by one of the heavy pillars, scarcely less heavy than itself, and indistinctly appeals to his companion for 40 winks of a second each. "If you will have it so, I must have it so," replies Jasper. "I'll not leave you here. Take them while I walk to and fro." Durdles is asleep at once, and in his sleep he dreams a dream. It is not much of a dream, considering the vast extent of the domains of dreamland and their wonderful productions. It is only remarkable for being unusually restless and unusually real. He dreams of lying there, asleep, and yet counting his companion's footsteps as he walks to and fro. He dreams that the footsteps die away into the distance of time and of space, and that something touches him, and that something falls from his hand. Then something clinks and gropes about, and he dreams that he is alone for so long a time that the lanes of light take new directions as the moon advances in her course. From succeeding unconsciousness, he passes into a dream of slow uneasiness from cold, and painfully awakes to a perception of the lanes of light really changed, much as he had dreamed, and Jasper walking among them, beating his hands and feet. "Halloa!" Durdles cries out, unmeaningly alarmed. "Awake at last," says Jasper, coming up to him. "Do you know that your 40s have stretched into thousands?" "No, they have, though. What's the time?" "Hark! The bells are going in the tower." They strike 4 quarters, and then the great bell strikes. "2?" cries Durdles, scrambling up. "Why didn't you try to wake me, Mr. Jasper?" "I did. I might as well have tried to wake the dead. Your own family of dead up in the corner there." "Did you touch me?" "Touch you? Yes, shook you." As Durdles recalls that touching something in his dream, he looks down on the pavement and sees the key of the crypt door lying close to where he himself lay. "I dropped you, did I?" he says, picking it up and recalling that part of his dream. As he gathers himself up again into an upright position, or into a position as nearly upright as he ever maintains, he is again conscious of being watched by his companion. "Well," says Jasper, smiling, "are you quite ready? Pray, don't hurry." "Let me get my bundle right, Mr. Jasper, and I'm with you." As he ties it afresh, he is once more conscious that he is very narrowly observed. "What do you suspect me of, Mr. Jasper?" he asks, with drunken displeasure. "Let them as has any suspicions of Durdles name 'em." "I've no suspicions of you, my good Mr. Durdles, but I have suspicions that my bottle was filled with something stiffer than either of us supposed. And I also have suspicions," Jasper added, taking it from the pavement and turning it bottom upwards, "that it's empty." Durdles concedes to laugh at this, continuing to chuckle when his laugh is over, as though remonstrant with himself of his drinking powers. He rolls to the door and unlocks it. They both pass out, and Durdles relocks it and pockets his key. "1,000 thanks for a curious and interesting night," says Jasper, giving him his hand. "You can make your own way home?" "I should think so," answers Durdles. "If you was to offer Durdles the affront to show him his way home, he wouldn't go home. Durdles wouldn't go home till morning, and then Durdles wouldn't go home. Durdles wouldn't." This with the utmost defiance. "Good night, then." "Good night, Mr. Jasper." Each is turning his own way when a sharp whistle rends the silence, and the jargon is yelped out. "Widdy widdy when, I catches him out after 10. Widdy widdy why, then he don't go, then I'll shy. Widdy widdy wake, cock warning." Instantly afterwards, a rapid fire of stones rattles at the cathedral wall, and the hideous small boy is beheld opposite, dancing in the moonlight. "What? Is that baby devil on the watch there?" cries Jasper in a fury, so quickly roused and so violent that he seems an older devil himself. "I shall shed the blood of that impish wretch. I know I shall do it." Regardless of the fire, though it hits him more than once, he rushes at Deputy, collars him, and tries to bring him across. But Deputy is not to be so easily brought across. With a diabolical insight into the strongest part of his position, he is no sooner taken by the throat than he curls up his legs, forces his assailant to hang him, as it were, and gurgles in his throat, and screws his body and twists as already undergoing the first agonies of strangulation. There is nothing for it but to drop him. He instantly gets himself together, backs over to Durdles, and cries to his assailant, gnashing the great gap in front of his mouth with rage and malice. "I'll blind you, s'helps me. I'll stone your eyes out, s'helps me. If I don't have your eyesight, bellers me." At the same time, dodging behind Durdles and snarling at Jasper, now from this side of him and now from that. Prepared, if pounced upon, to dart away in all manner of curvilinear directions, and, if run down after all, to grovel in the dust and cry, "Now hit me when I'm down, do it." "Don't hurt the boy, Mr. Jasper," urges Durdles, shielding him. "Recollect yourself. He followed us tonight when we first came here." "You lie, I didn't," replies Deputy, in his one form of polite contradiction. "He has been prowling near us ever since." "You lie, I haven't," returns Deputy. "I'd only just come out from my health when I see you two are coming out of the cathedral. If I catches him out after 10... with the usual rhythm and dance, though dodging behind Durdles, "it ain't any fault, is it?" "Take him home, then," retorts Jasper, ferociously, though with a strong check upon himself, "and let my eyes be rid of the sight of you." Deputy, with another sharp whistle, at once expressing his relief and his commencement of a milder stoning of Mr. Durdles, begins stoning that respectable gentleman home as if he were a reluctant ox. Mr. Jasper goes to his gatehouse, brooding, and thus, as everything comes to an end, the unaccountable expedition comes to an end, for the time. Chapter 13. Both at their best. Miss Twinkleton's establishment was about to undergo a serene hush. The Christmas recess was at hand. What had once, and at no remote period, been called, even by the erudite Miss Twinkleton herself, the half, but what was now called, as being more elegant and more strictly collegiate, the term, would expire tomorrow. A noticeable relaxation of discipline had for some few days pervaded the nun's house. Club suppers had occurred in the bedrooms, and a dressed tongue had been carved with a pair of scissors and handed round with the curling tongs. Portions of marmalade had likewise been distributed on a service of plates constructed of curl paper, and cowslip wine had been quaffed from the small squat measuring glass in which little Ricketts, a junior of weakly constitution, took her steel drops daily. The housemaids had been bribed with various fragments of riband and sundry pairs of shoes more or less down at heel, to make no mention of crumbs in the beds. The airiest costumes had been worn on these festive occasions, and the daring Miss Ferdinand had even surprised the company with a sprightly solo on the comb and curl paper, until suffocated in her own pillow by two flowing-haired executioners. Nor were these the only tokens of dispersal. Boxes appeared in the bedrooms, where they were capital at other times, and a surprising amount of packing took place, out of all proportion to the amount packed. Largesse, in the form of odds and ends of cold cream and pomatum, and also of hairpins, was freely distributed among the attendants. On charges of inviolable secrecy, confidences were interchanged respecting golden youth of England expected to call at home on the first opportunity. Miss Giggles, deficient in sentiment, did indeed profess that she, for her part, acknowledged such homage by making faces at the golden youth, but this young lady was outvoted by an immense majority. On the last night before a recess, it was always expressly made a point of honour that nobody should go to sleep, and that ghosts should be encouraged by all possible means. This compact invariably broke down, and all the young ladies went to sleep very soon, and got up very early. The concluding ceremony came off at 12 o'clock on the day of departure, when Miss Twinkleton, supported by Mrs. Tisher, held a drawing-room in her own apartment, the globes already covered with brown holland, where glasses of white wine and plates of cut-pound cake were discovered on the table. Miss Twinkleton then said, "Ladies, another revolving year had brought us round to that festive period at which the first feelings of our nature bounded in our—" Miss Twinkleton was annually going to add bosoms, but annually stopped on the brink of that expression and substituted hearts. Hearts, our hearts. Again, a revolving year, ladies, had brought us to a pause in our studies. Let us hope our greatly advanced studies, and, like the mariner in his bark, the warrior in his tent, the captive in his dungeon, and the traveller in his various conveyances, we yearned for home. Did we say on such an occasion, in the opening words of Mr. Addison's impressive tragedy, "The dawn is overcast, the morning lowers, and heavily in clouds brings on the day, the great, the important day"? Not so. From horizon to zenith all was couleur de rose, for all was redolent of our relations with friends. Might we find them prospering as we expected, might they find us prospering as they expected. Ladies, we would now, with our love to one another, wish one another good-bye and happiness until we meet again. And when the time should come for our resumption of those pursuits which— here a general depression set in all round— pursuits which— then let us ever remember what was said by the Spartan general in words too trite for repetition, at the battle it were superfluous to specify. The handmaidens of the establishment, in their best caps, then handed the trays, and the young ladies sipped and crumbled, and the bespoken coaches began to choke the street. Then leave-taking was not long about, and Miss Twinkleton, in saluting each young lady's cheek, confided to her an exceedingly neat letter, addressed to her next friend at law, with Miss Twinkleton's best compliments, in the corner. This missive she handed with an air as if it had not the least connection with the bill, but was something in the nature of a delicate and joyful surprise. So many times had Rosa seen such dispersals, and so very little did she know of any other home, that she was contented to remain where she was, and was even better contented than ever before, having her latest friend with her. And yet her latest friendship had a blank place in it of which she could not fail to be sensible. Helena Landless, having been a party to her brother's revelation about Rosa, and having entered into that compact of silence with Mr. Crisparkle, shrank from any allusion to Edwin Drood's name. Why she so avoided it was mysterious to Rosa, but she perfectly perceived the fact. But for the fact, she might have relieved her own little perplexed heart of some of its doubts and hesitations by taking Helena into her confidence. As it was, she had no such vent. She could only ponder on her own difficulties and wonder more and more why this avoidance of Edwin's name should at last, now that she knew, for so much Helena had told her, that a good understanding was to be re-established between the two young men when Edwin came down. It would have made a pretty picture, So many pretty girls kissing Rosa in the cold porch of the nun's house, and that sunny little creature peeping out of it, unconscious of sly faces carved on spout and gable peeping at her, and waving farewells to the departing coaches, as if she represented the spirit of rosy youth abiding in the place to keep it bright and warm in its desertion. The hoarse High Street became musical with the cry, in various silvery voices, "Goodbye, Rosebud, darling," and the effigy of Mr. Sapsea's father over the opposite doorway seemed to say to mankind, "Gentlemen, favour me with your attention to this charming little last lot left behind, and bid with a spirit worthy of the occasion." Then the stage street, so unwontedly sparkling, youthful, and fresh for a few rippling moments, ran dry, and Cloister was itself again. If Rosebud in her bower now waited Edwin Drood's coming with an uneasy heart, Edwin, for his part, was uneasy too. With far less force of purpose in his composition than the childish beauty, crowned by acclamation fairy queen of Miss Twinkleton's establishment, he had a conscience, and Mr. Grewgious had pricked it. That gentleman's steady convictions of what was right and what was wrong in such a case as his were neither to be frowned aside nor laughed aside. They would not be moved. But for the dinner in Staple Inn, and but for the ring he carried in the breast pocket of his coat, he would have drifted into their wedding day without another pause for real thought, loosely trusting that all would go well, left alone. But that serious putting him on his truth to the living and the dead had brought him to a check. He must either give the ring to Rosa, or he must take it back. Once put into this narrowed way of action, it was curious that he began to consider Rosa's claims upon him more unselfishly than he had ever considered them before, and began to be less sure of himself than he had ever been in all his easy-going days. "I will be guided by what she says, and by how we get on," was his decision, walking from the gatehouse to the nun's house. "Whatever comes of it, I will bear his words in mind and try to be true to the living and the dead." Rosa was dressed for walking. She expected him. It was a bright, frosty day, and Miss Twinkleton had already graciously sanctioned fresh air. Thus they got out together before it became necessary for either Miss Twinkleton or the deputy high priest, Mrs. Tisher, to lay even so much as one of those usual offerings of the shrine of propriety. "My dear Eddie," said Rosa, when they had turned out of the High Street and had got among the quiet walks in the neighbourhood of the cathedral and the river, "I want to say something very serious to you. I have been thinking about it for a long, long time." "I want to be serious with you too, Rosa dear. I mean to be serious and earnest." "Thank you, Eddie. And you will not think me unkind because I begin, will you? You will not think I speak for myself only because I speak first? That would not be generous, would it? And I know you are generous." He said, "I hope I'm not ungenerous to you, Rosa." He called her pussy no more. Never again. "And there is no fear," pursued Rosa, "of our quarrelling, is there? Because, Eddie," clasping her hand on his arm, "we have so much reason to be very lenient to each other." "We will be, Rosa." "That's a dear good boy. Eddie, let us be courageous. Let us change to brother and sister from this day forth. Never to be husband and wife? Never." Neither spoke again for a little while, but after that pause he said, with some effort, "Of course, I know that this has been in both our minds, Rosa, and of course I am in honour bound to confess freely that it does not originate with you." "No, nor with you, dear," she returned with pathetic earnestness. "That sprung up between us. You are not truly happy in our engagement. I am not truly happy in it. Oh, I am so sorry, so sorry." And there she broke into tears. "I am deeply sorry too, Rosa, deeply sorry for you." "And I for you, poor boy, and I for you." This pure young feeling, this gentle and forbearing feeling of each towards the other, brought with it its reward in a softening light that seemed to shine on their position. The relations between them did not look wilful, or capricious, or a failure in such a light. They became elevated into something more self-denying, honourable, affectionate, and true. "If we knew yesterday," said Rosa, as she dried her eyes, "and we did know yesterday, and on so many, many yesterdays, that we were far from right together in those relations which were not of our own choosing, what better could we do today than change them? It is natural that we should be sorry, and you see how sorry we both are, but how much better to be sorry now than then." "When, Rosa?" "When it would be too late, and then we should be angry besides." Another silence fell upon them. "And you know," said Rosa innocently, "you couldn't like me then, and you can always like me now, for I shall not be a drag upon you, or a worry to you, and I can always like you now, and your sister will not tease or trifle with you. I often did when I was not your sister, and I beg your pardon for it." "Don't let us come to that, Rosa, or I shall want more pardoning than I like to think of." "No, indeed, Eddie. You are too hard, my generous boy, upon yourself. Let us sit down, brother, on these ruins, and let me tell you how it was with us. I think I know, for I have considered about it very much since you were here last time. You liked me, didn't you? You thought I was a nice little thing. Everybody thinks that, Rosa. Do they?" She knitted her brow musingly for a moment, and then flashed out with the bright little induction. "Well, but say they do. Surely it was not enough that you should think of me only as other people did, now was it?" The point was not to be got over. It was not enough. "And that is just what I meant. That is just how it was with us," said Rosa. "You liked me very well, and you had grown used to me, and had grown used to the idea of our being married. You accepted the situation as an inevitable kind of thing, didn't you? It was to be, you thought, and why discuss or dispute it?" It was new and strange to him to have himself presented to himself so clearly, in a glass of her holding up. He had always patronized her in his superiority to her share of women's wit. Was that but another instance of something radically amiss in the terms on which they had been gliding towards a lifelong bondage? "All this that I say of you is true of me as well, Eddie. Unless it was, I might not be bold enough to say it. Only the difference between us was that by little and little there crept into my mind a habit of thinking about it instead of dismissing it. My life is not so busy as yours, you see, and I have not so many things to think of. So I thought about it very much, and I cried about it very much too, though that was not your fault, poor boy. When all at once my guardian came down to prepare for my leaving the nun's house. I tried to hint to him that I was not quite settled in my mind, but I hesitated and failed, and he didn't understand me. But he is a good, good man, and he put before me so kindly and yet so strongly how seriously we ought to consider, in our circumstances, that I resolved to speak to you the next moment we were alone and grave. And if I seem to come to it easily just now, because I came to it all at once, don't think it was so really, Eddie, for, oh, it was very, very hard, and oh, I am very, very sorry." Her full heart broke into tears again. He put his arm about her waist, and they walked by the riverside together. "Your guardian has spoken to me too, Rosa dear. I saw him before I left London." His right hand was in his breast, seeking the ring, but he checked it as he thought, "If I am to take it back, why should I tell her of it?" "And that made you more serious about it, didn't it, Eddie? And if I had not spoken to you, as I have, you would have spoken to me? I hope you can tell me so. I don't like it to be all my doing, though it is so much better for us." "Yes, I should have spoken. I should have put everything before you. I came intending to do it, but I never could have spoken to you as you have spoken to me, Rosa." "Don't say you mean so coldly or unkindly, Eddie, please, if you can help it." "I mean so sensibly and delicately, so wisely and affectionately." "That's my dear brother." She kissed his hand in a little rapture. "The dear girls will be dreadfully disappointed," added Rosa, laughing, with the dewdrops glistening in her bright eyes. "They have looked forward to it so, poor pets." "Ah, but I fear it will be a worse disappointment to Jack," said Edwin Drood with a start. "I never thought of Jack." Her swift and intent look at him as he said the words could no more be recalled than a flash of lightning can, but it appeared as though she would have instantly have recalled it if she could, for she looked down confused and breathed quickly. "You don't doubt its being a blow to Jack, Rosa?" She merely replied, and that evasively and hurriedly. Why should she? She had not thought about it. He seemed to her to have so little to do with it. "My dear child, can you suppose that anyone so wrapped up in another, Mrs. Tope's expression, not mine, as Jack is in me, could fail to be struck all of a heap by such a sudden and complete change in my life? I say sudden because it will be sudden to him, you know." She nodded twice or thrice, and her lips parted as if she would have assented. But she uttered no sound, and her breathing was no slower. "How shall I tell Jack?" said Edwin, ruminating. If he had been less occupied with the thought, he must have seen her singular emotion. "I never thought of Jack. It must be broken to him before the town crier knows it. I dine with the dear fellow tomorrow and next day, Christmas Eve and Christmas Day, but it would never do to spoil his feast days. He always worries about me, and moddly-coddlies in the merest trifles. The news is sure to overset him. How on earth shall this be broken to Jack?" "He must be told, I suppose," said Rosa. "My dear Rosa, who ought to be in our confidence if not Jack?" "My guardian promised to come down if I should write and ask him. I am going to do so. Would you like to leave it to him?" "A bright idea," cried Edwin. "The other trustee. Nothing more natural. He comes down, he goes to Jack, he relates what we have agreed upon, and he states our case better than we could. He has already spoken feelingly to you, he has already spoken feelingly to me, and he'll put the whole thing feelingly to Jack. That's it. I'm not a coward, Rosa, but to tell you a secret, I am a little afraid of Jack." "No, no, you are not afraid of him," cried Rosa, turning white and clasping her hands. "Why, Sister Rosa, what do you see from the turret?" said Edwin, rallying her. "My dear girl, you frightened me." "Most unintentionally, but I am as sorry as if I had meant to do it. Could you possibly suppose for a moment, from any loose way of speaking of mine, that I was literally afraid of the dear fond fellow? What I mean is that he is subject to a kind of paroxysm, or fit. I saw him in it once, and I don't know but that so great a surprise, coming upon him direct from me, whom he is so wrapped up in, might bring it on, perhaps. Which, and this is the secret I was going to tell you, is another reason for your guardian's making the communication. He is so steady, precise, and exact, that he will talk Jack's thoughts into shape in no time. Whereas with me, Jack is always impulsive and hurried, and, I may say, almost womanish." Rosa seemed convinced. Perhaps from her own very different point of view of Jack, she felt comforted and protected by the interposition of Mr. Grewgious between herself and him. And now Edwin Drood's right hand closed again upon the ring in its little case, and again was checked by the consideration. "It is certain now that I am to give it back to him. Then why should I tell her of it?" That pretty, sympathetic nature, which could be so sorry for him in the blight of their childish hopes of happiness together, and could so quietly find itself alone in a new world to weave fresh wreaths of such flowers as it might prove to bear, the old world's flowers being withered, would be grieved by those sorrowful jewels. And to what purpose? Why should it be? They were but a sign of broken joys and baseless projects. In their very beauty they were, as the unlikeliest of men had said, almost a cruel satire on the loves, hopes, plans of humanity, which are able to forecast nothing, and are so much brittle dust. Let them be. He would restore them to her guardian when he came down. He, in his turn, would restore them to the cabinet from which he had unwillingly taken them, and there, like old letters or old vows, or other records of old aspirations come to nothing, they would be disregarded until, being valuable, they were sold into circulation again to repeat their former round. Let them be. Let them lie unspoken of in his breast. However distinctly or indistinctly he entertained these thoughts, he arrived at the conclusion, let them be. Among the mighty store of wonderful chains that are forever forging day and night in the vast ironworks of time and circumstance, there was one chain forged in the moment of that small conclusion, riveted to the foundations of heaven and earth, and gifted with invincible force to hold and drag. They walked on by the river. They began to speak of their separate plans. He would quicken his departure from England, and she would remain where she was, at least as long as Helena remained. The poor dear girls should have their disappointment broken to them gently, and, as the first preliminary, Miss Twinkleton should be confided in by Rosa, even in advance of the reappearance of Mr. Grewgious. It should be made clear in all quarters that she and Edwin were the best of friends. There had never been so serene an understanding between them since they were first affianced. And yet there was one reservation on each side. On hers, that she intended, through her guardian, to withdraw herself immediately from the tuition of her music-master. On his, that he did already entertain some wandering speculations whether it might ever come to pass that he would know more of Miss Landless. The bright, frosty day declined as they walked and spoke together. The sun dipped in the river far behind them, and the old city lay red before them, as their walk drew to a close. The moaning water cast its seaweed duskily at their feet when they turned to leave its margin, and the rooks hovered above them with hoarse cries, darker splashes in the darkening air. "I will prepare Jack for my flitting soon," said Edwin in a low voice, "and I will but see your guardian when he comes, and then go before they speak together. It will be better done without my being by. Don't you think so?" "Yes. We know we have done right, Rosa." "Yes. We know we are better so, even now, and shall be far, far better so by and by." Still, there was that lingering tenderness in their hearts towards the old positions they were relinquishing, that they prolonged their parting. When they came among the elm trees by the cathedral, where they had last sat together, they stopped as by consent, and Rosa raised her face to his, as she had never raised it in the old days, for they were old already. "God bless you, dear. Goodbye." "God bless you, dear. Goodbye." They kissed each other fervently. "Now, please take me home, Eddie, and let me be by myself." "Don't look round, Rosa," he cautioned her, as he drew her arm through his and led her away. "Didn't you see Jack?" "No. Where?" "Under the trees. He saw us, as we took leave of each other. Poor fellow, he little thinks we have parted. This will be a blow to him, I am much afraid." She hurried on without resting, and hurried on until they had passed under the gatehouse into the street. Once there, she asked, "Has he followed us? You can look without seeming to. Is he behind?" "No. Yes, he is. He has just passed out under the gateway. The dear, sympathetic old fellow likes to keep us in sight. I am afraid he will be bitterly disappointed." She pulled hurriedly at the handle of the hoarse old bell, and the gate soon opened. Before going in, she gave him one last, wide, wondering look, as if she would have asked him with imploring emphasis, "Oh, don't you understand?" And out of that look he vanished from her view. Chapter 14. When shall these three meet again? Christmas Eve in Cloister. A few strange faces in the streets, a few other faces, half strange and half familiar, once the faces of Cloisterham children, now the faces of men and women who come back from the outer world at long intervals to find the city wonderfully shrunken in size, as if it had not washed by any means well in the meanwhile. To these, the striking of the cathedral clock and the cawing of the rooks from the cathedral tower are like voices of their nursery time. To such as these, it has happened in their dying hours afar off that they have imagined their chamber floor to be strewn with the autumnal leaves fallen from the elm trees in the close. So have the rustling sounds and fresh scents of their earliest impressions revived when the circle of their lives was very nearly traced, and the beginning and the end were drawing close together. Seasonable tokens are about. Red berries shine here and there in the lattices of Minor Canon Corner. Mr. and Mrs. Tope are daintily sticking sprigs of holly into the carvings and sconnesses of the cathedral stalls, as if they were sticking them into the coat-buttoned holes of the dean and chapter. Lavish profusion is in the shops, particularly the articles of currants, raisins, spices, candied peel, and moist sugar. An unusual air of gallantry and dissipation is abroad, evinced in an immense bunch of mistletoe hanging in the greengrocer's shop doorway, and a poor little 12th cake culminating in the figure of a harlequin. Such a very poor little 12th cake that one would rather called it a 24th cake or a 48th cake, to be raffled for at the pastry cook's, terms 1 shilling per member. Public amusements are not wanting. The waxwork, which made so deep an impression on the reflective mind of the Emperor of China, is to be seen by particular desire during Christmas week only on the premises of the bankrupt livery stable keeper up the lane. And a new grand comic Christmas pantomime is to be produced at the theatre, the latter heralded by the portrait of Signor Jack Sonini, the clown, saying, "How do you do tomorrow?" quite as large as life and almost as miserably. In short, Cloisterham is up and doing, though from this description the High School and Miss Twinkleton's are to be excluded. From the former establishment the scholars have gone home, every one of them in love with one of Miss Twinkleton's young ladies, who knows nothing about it, and only the handmaidens flutter occasionally in the windows of the latter. It is noticed, by the by, that these damsels become, within the limits of decorum, more skittish when thus entrusted with the concrete representation of their sex, than when dividing the representation with Miss Twinkleton's young ladies. 3 are to meet at the gatehouse tonight. How does each one of the 3 get through the day? Neville Landless, though absolved from his books for the time by Mr. Crisparkle, whose fresh nature is by no means insensible to the charms of a holiday, reads and writes in his quiet room, with a concentrated air, until it is 2 hours past noon. He then sets himself to clearing his table, to arranging his books, and to tearing up and burning his stray papers. He makes a clean sweep of all untidy accumulations, puts all his drawers in order, and leaves no note or scrap of paper undestroyed, save such memoranda as bear directly on his studies. This done, he turns to his wardrobe, selects a few articles of ordinary wear, among them change of stout shoes and socks for walking, and packs these in a knapsack. This knapsack is new, and he bought it in the High Street yesterday. He also purchased, at the same time and at the same place, a heavy walking stick, strong in the handle for the grip of the hand, and iron shod. He tries this, swings it, poises it, and lays it by, with the knapsack,